This video is sponsored by World Anvil. This is a topic that I've considered tackling in the normal Critical Role Demystified series. Like at some point, I figured we would get to a scene in a future episode that I could use as an example. But honestly, I got a comment on one of my demystified videos that made me want to just break this off into its own video. The comment read, "Imagine getting paid millions of dollars to play a game and not knowing the rules. Couldn't be me." Now I get comments like this all the time about the cast members of Critical Role. Usually one cast member in particular, but not always. In this case, I think they were referencing a spell that Sam had misread. But this comment, despite being super short, kind of touches on a bunch of aspects of this topic that come up in other similar comments without getting into the more toxic aspects that show up in some other comments. And so I kind of wanted to tackle this subject. Why doesn't the cast of Critical Role know the rules to D&D? And why have I never brought that up as a lesson we can learn as players? AKA, why don't I think it's a big deal whether the cast knows their spells? That's what we're talking about today. I should clarify that this subject is especially relevant to Campaign 1, which are the episodes we're reviewing on this channel currently. But I'm sure there are moments even now in Campaign 3, 9 years into the show, where the players get rules wrong. And if that bothers you, then I'm thinking this video might be for you. I also want to clarify, I'm not making this video to defend Critical Role. As we'll discuss shortly, they're doing just fine. They don't need me to go to bat for them. And I've got a whole video series where I try to make genuine critiques to point out the things we can actually learn from to improve our home games. But the reason I'm talking about this is because when people say things like this about Critical Role, it's reasonable to assume they might believe there are reasons why some players, even just a few very famous players, would have no excuse to not know the rules. And I think that's a problem. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the idea that the cast of Critical Role gets paid millions of dollars to play D&D, because I don't think that's true. Now, I'm not talking about how much they're making. Like, they are making millions of dollars across all of their platforms. That's definitely true. I mean, I don't think the cast is pocketing millions of dollars individually because they put the money into their projects. Like, they don't take their games to Kickstarter because they just generally use their profits to pay for the next book or game they plan to publish. They also have a bunch of employees with full-time salaries, and they probably provide healthcare as well because this is the United States of America, and healthcare is tied to employment because our leaders have tricked us into thinking that it's more important to be an individual and look after yourself than it is to pay literally any amount of money to take care of the underserved in our community. So I don't think the cast are all individually millionaires because they've got some serious expenses. But also, as long as I keep hearing stories about how they treat their artists and collaborators with respect, I kind of don't care either way. I don't think the relevant part of this comment is how much the cast members get paid. What's far more interesting is the question of what they get paid for. This commenter points out that the players get paid to play a game. And the implication there is that they're being paid to play the game well. But what that means depends a lot on what you think of as the most important part of D&D. Like, there are some episodes of Critical Role that have made me cry. These are characters that I care about and stories I think are genuinely fantastic. And if that's all being accomplished by some folks sitting down to play a game, then I think that means they're playing the game well. Are they always following the rules? No. Not always. Sometimes they know that, and sometimes they don't. But I've watched a lot of actual play shows, and if I'm completely honest, actual play shows don't succeed by the strength of the game they're playing. If you doubt that, just look at how many 5e actual plays there are. Some of them have told epic, emotional stories. Some have been hilarious or frightening. And some have just been a recording of some people playing D&D completely unspectacularly. They might be having fun, but that's no guarantee that the show will be exciting for an audience. If the game was the reason a show succeeded or failed, trust me, there are a ton of 5e actual plays. You would have heard about a lot more of them. So I'm not convinced the cast of Critical Role is being paid to play D&D according to the rules. Now, don't get me wrong, I think 5e was a good system for them to switch to for the live stream. It was a friendlier system for them to play on stream than their previous game, Pathfinder. It was easier for folks to jump on board with a show that was streaming a relatively new game. It had extremely good SEO, and getting a bunch of comments about how you're playing the game wrong probably helps a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And yes, there are definitely some people who watch them because they're a D&D show. Maybe those audience members are players or GMs looking for ideas for their 5e games. Maybe they just watch Critical Role because it's how they engage with the D&D community. Or maybe they just enjoy watching a game where they, as an audience member, already know the system really well. And more on that later. But regardless, I do think Critical Role will lose a couple people whenever they inevitably switch to a game system besides 5th edition. And not just because their audience really seems to hate change. But I think, generally speaking, it doesn't matter that much what system they're playing, because the audience is watching for them. If you like the cast and the GM, and you like the format of the show, and you like the story they're telling, then the game system doesn't really matter that much. I'm not always a huge fan of Critical Role's one-shots. I think some of them are amazing, and others just don't do that much for me. But that's true regardless of which system they're playing, whether it's 5e or another game. because what I enjoy about Critical Role is usually when they tell a longer story, even if it's just a couple of episodes, like the various Exandria Unlimited miniseries. You might watch Critical Role for other reasons, and yeah, maybe for you, it is because of the game they're playing, more so than the other factors. But that's not true for everyone. That's not why they get paid millions of dollars. They got paid because people liked watching them. That's literally it. Now, in fairness, the cast is essentially promoting 5th edition, and eventually they'd be sponsored by D&D Beyond and work with Wizards of the Coast on creating tie-in material. So you might argue, well, shouldn't they at least try to play by the rules to appease their corporate masters? And we'll talk later in this video about why I don't even think that's true. Now, it is definitely true that the cast does not know the rules for 5e incredibly well, especially early in the show's run. Now, sometimes they do get the rules right, and most of the time, that doesn't get commented upon, because it's not that noticeable that they're playing by the rules. There's the occasional moment where a singular cast member busts out a rule and impresses everyone with their strategy, but in every game session, players are playing by the rules in completely unremarkable ways. Other times, they get stuff wrong, but there are a lot of reasons for that. And the most obvious reason, especially in the Vox Machina campaign, is that they switched to the system partway through an ongoing campaign. These players converted their characters from Pathfinder to D&D 5e when they were around level 8, and that is a huge change, and it's very late in the campaign to make that switch. That's after 2 years of play, and while they used to just play something like once a month in their home games, that's still a long time in that system. And we saw the cast struggle with those changes a lot. Vex was so underpowered in the Vox Machina streamed campaign, and I imagine a big reason for that was because the 5e Ranger in the player's handbook is kind of ass. It's actually perfectly designed for players who happen to know exactly what the designers expected of them, and for a very specific type of campaign, but there's hardly any onboarding to guide players to that conclusion. No way to make sure the GM runs that kind of campaign to make that playstyle shine, and certainly no way for Laura to get the same experience when she converted her existing character for an ongoing campaign. The Beastmaster Ranger is especially rough in that book. Honestly, if the pitch for the upcoming revised D&D edition was just, we're retooling the Beastmaster Ranger so it doesn't suck, and we're changing very little else, I would buy that $60 rulebook in a heartbeat. And Laura wasn't the only player who had to wrestle with new mechanics. Liam had a hell of a time remembering how sneak attack worked. He constantly thought that getting sneak attack meant rolling with advantage, when actually it's the reverse. An attack rolled with advantage qualifies for sneak attack. But again, he got a level 8 character sheet and a brand new system. That's a lot of new features to keep track of. Matt, Taliesin, and Marisha had also played a lot of D&D and Pathfinder as adults, so sometimes they remember rules and mechanics from different systems. There was a moment where Taliesin said, "Oh yeah, you can actually use your action to perform a bonus action task." And Matt had to remind him, "No, not in this version of the system." I don't know if that's something from Pathfinder, but I know that was something that happened in 4th edition. That is how bonus actions and actions worked with each other. And this wasn't even in the Vox Machina campaign. This was much later. I think it may have even been in Campaign 3, if not late in Campaign 2. They've been playing 5th edition for like 6 years at that point, and still the rules for an old system came bubbling up to the surface of Talisin's brain. And that's completely normal. And during the Briarwood arc, Keyleth cast Heat Metal on Vax's daggers and realized the spell worked differently in 5th edition, so their old strategy to heat up a weapon and have it do extra damage was not going to work anymore, because their familiar tactics couldn't be converted to the new system. That actually brings me to my next point. D&D has some misleadingly named spells. So sometimes a player will read a spell name and think, oh, I get it. This is absolutely not unique to the players on Critical Role. I've seen it happen in many, many different groups. For example, let's look at the spell that this commenter was reacting to. In episode 50, Scanlan cast invisibility on himself and snuck into Westron. Then he cast another spell and he discovered right then that invisibility ends when you cast another spell. Now, Sam understood how concentration worked, so he knew he couldn't cast another concentration spell while invisible. And besides that, he read the title Invisibility, and he read the parameters for how long it lasts, and he got the gist. He figured he had all the information he needed. And so he missed the last line of the spell because he hadn't needed to read the spell for a long time, because he figured he understood it. Now, even without digging into the spells, lots of people get wrong, even if they know the system pretty well, like Jump and Thunderwave that are constantly confusing to even experienced players. There are still dozens of spells that new players just misunderstand. I've run a lot of games for new players, and I see it all the time. And these players don't think they don't understand the spell, so they don't think to investigate it further. It takes a while for them to train themselves to look at the description every time they're going to cast it, even if the title of the spell seems really clear. And there are some spells that are infamous for tripping up players because they don't work how they seem like they'd work. For example, did you know the spell Find Traps doesn't actually tell you where the traps are? Did you know the spell Daylight doesn't create sunlight? Why would you? It doesn't say that anywhere in the description. So even if somebody does take the time to read Daylight or Jump or Thunderwave, the description omits important context that completely changes how the spell functions in the game. And that's another thing. Not everyone reads their spells in advance or rereads their spells at the moment they cast them. And don't get me wrong, I don't think not reading your spells is a virtue or anything. When Keyleth cast Windwalk and didn't realize that it wasn't a good spell for combat because the characters can't attack, Matt said read your spells multiple times as they were adjudicating the results of that spell, because, yeah, there was some important information in that spell that she missed. But it seems like the players can't win with the audience. If Marisha doesn't read all of her spells before she selects them and only reads them in the moment when she's actually getting ready to cast them, then the audience accuses her of not knowing her spells. Now, when the stream began, Keyleth was 8th level. By my count, an 8th level character, an 8th level druid, has access to almost 80 spells, just from the Player's Handbook and the Elemental Evil Player's Companion that were out at the time, not counting Keyleth's cantrips or the other spells that Keyleth would have gotten as she leveled up throughout the Craghammer and Briarwood arcs. So yeah, she didn't read all 80 spells before choosing them. She has to pick them each time she takes a long rest, based on their level and maybe a quick scan of the description. Meanwhile, someone like Sam might choose a spell when he levels up and he'll read how it works in that moment because he's not a prepared caster, so he can take the time to read the spell before choosing it. And yet, he may not remember exactly how it works when it actually comes time to cast it. And so once again, he gets accused of not knowing his spells. And again, this isn't a situation unique to Critical Role. This happens at home games all the time. Players might skim their spells, but they'll miss some details. It does happen. Even in this moment from Campaign 3, the players forgot how scrying works, despite the fact that they've used this spell multiple times in every campaign so far. There are no spoilers in this clip, besides the character's stats in the corner, so I'll conceal those. I haven't even seen the episode this clip is from because I'm very behind on Critical Role, but this moment still made the rounds on social media because it's just wildly entertaining.
Okay. What are we rolling for?
Come on! Simul Scribe!
I'm just rolling something. Natural 20.
They're gonna freeze that bitch.
Wait, we're doing it at the same time?
Yeah, Simul Scribe.
Like the same circle?
You gotta get a 20. Don't fuck it up.
Well, okay.
Get 20. You can do it.
Don't pick one of those little things.
You do have to
No,
roll
the
it.
real one.
What?
Wow, that was a crazy roll.
It
I feel like it doesn't count, it's gonna count.
God.
Wait, what am I?
I'm sorry,
Yeah?
Matthew.
It's like,
Hang on
it
one
doesn't work.
second.
It doesn't matter.
What is she adding?
Nothing. You don't roll for scrap.
They do.
8 years!
I'm just. I thought the walk was just let it happen.
Oh my god!
You just let us hang ourselves.
Okay.
8 years!
All right.
That was for me.
We're just doing it. They just do it.
Walk right off. All right.
Also, we've been talking about players not reading spells, but when Megaphone Man watched the infamous Windwalk scene, one of his chatters, Rainbow Dragon, made an excellent point. They said if Marisha hadn't read the spell, she wouldn't know how it worked at all, and she mostly did, with the exception of one line in the description and one note about the casting time. In other words, she misread it. That's different. Read your spells is too broad a critique because sometimes people just misread things. And that has to be okay. And if the idea of a player getting a spell wrong bothers you, okay, fine. Make it a bigger deal at your games. Make sure the players know you want them to have their spells ready. But along those lines, I don't think Matt has made it a priority for his players to read their spells. We can see this in action by the behavior he challenges and the behavior he enables. For example, whenever the players are trying to recall knowledge about something that happened in the campaign, it is very common for Matt to just sit back and wait for them to find a detail in their own notes. Sometimes he'll bail them out, especially if his players argue that their characters would remember something better than the players would, but most of the time, he waits to see what they remember or what they wrote down. As a result, his cast has learned to take really good notes, and they've learned to become better active listeners. And by this point, if they miss a detail or forget to write something down, then they know what's expected of them, and they shouldn't be surprised if Matt doesn't bail them out by always telling them something they feel like they would remember. On the other hand, almost every time a player casts a spell, especially during combat, Matt will grab a player's handbook and read the spell. And quite frankly, if you want to teach your players to read their own spells, this is not how you do it. I would instead recommend asking them to read you the spell the first time they cast it, and 9 times out of 10, if there's something they are at all misunderstanding, they'll read it and go, oh, wait, this doesn't work how I thought it does. But Matt doesn't do that. Now, I assume the reason for that is because he doesn't want to slow down the show, especially during combat, and I can absolutely understand why. He's trying to keep the audience in mind. Fair enough. This may have also been a result of the problem player he was dealing with in the early episodes of Vox Machina, so he developed the habit of checking his players' work himself by looking everything up on his side. But again, regardless of his motivations, he's still unconsciously teaching his players a lesson. They don't actually have to look up the spells, because Matt will do it for them. If they misunderstood something, Matt will catch it and correct them. Now again, that's not to say that every rules debate about the spells means the cast members didn't read the spell. As we talked about in another video, sometimes cast members just don't know how Matt is going to rule on a spell, and there's not necessarily a way for them to anticipate that. But on the occasions where they do actually get the spell wrong, Matt will notice and deal with it, and they know that. But there are some times, especially in the first few years of the show, where a player will cast a spell and they'll misunderstand some key detail, and Matt will hold them to it. Very occasionally in the early campaigns, he might jump in and say, before you cast the spell, you should realize it will lead to this result. Are you sure you want to do that? But other times, especially during campaign 1, he was a lot more strict. Skinlan casts Thunder Wave while he's invisible? Okay, you're not invisible anymore. Keyleth casts Wind Walk on the party? Okay, they can't take actions besides dashing or spending a minute to revert back. Whereas I would argue that the player characters would be more familiar with their spells than their players are, but that often wasn't Matt's approach. He instead often took a much more strict, touch move, play it where it lies approach. This means he was effectively punishing his players for not reading their spells. But Mike, you might be saying, you just said Matt never enforced making his players read their spells. But if he was punishing them for not reading their spells, then surely you're wrong. That was his way of enforcing them reading their spells. Yes, that's true. And it was a shitty way to handle it. First of all, not everyone learns from negative reinforcement. Second, as I've already said, the characters in the world of the game would be more familiar with their spells than the players are, so you can and probably should give them some grace. Third, Matt has since confessed and confirmed that he was frequently too harsh with these rulings. At the time, he felt the pressure from thousands of rules lawyers DMing him to try to make him be more strict with his players, and he later regretted it and started making an effort to be more reasonable with his friends as they're all learning to play a pretty complicated game. And fourth, and most notably, whenever Matt punished a player for not knowing a rule, it changes the narrative around Critical Role. Imagine two scenarios. In one, a player goes to do something just like casting a spell, and Matt says, just to clarify, that's not how it works, and the player has a chance to say, oh, I didn't realize that, okay, let me amend my plan. In the second scenario, a player goes to do something like cast a spell, and Matt says, okay, this happens. And the player says, wait, I didn't realize that would happen. And Matt basically says, too bad, it happened anyway, sucks to suck. Now, maybe you're the type of person who argues that there is a virtue in holding players accountable for understanding what they're going to do in the game before they do something, because players should take the time and understand all of the rules to the game, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But this isn't a hypothetical. Scenario 2 happened over and over again, and every time, it led to the same result. The player felt frustrated because they wanted to do something cool, and now not only could they not do that cool thing, but things went wrong somehow. The other players might also get some collateral punishment as these unexpected consequences impacted the campaign, and so now they're frustrated. And the audience basically takes a cue from Matt and argues, well, those players should have known better. And then they'll feel like they can harass those players on social media, especially if it was one of the female cast members. Matt's tough love approach to resolving these rules almost universally led to more toxicity in the critter community. He wasn't offering the players very much grace or understanding, and unfortunately, the audience learned that they could do the same thing. They could talk about how the players screwed up. There's also another piece of context that we need to address, because early in Campaign 1, the cast would make suggestions for how they could use the spells in non-standard ways, and Matt would often say, sure, or he might say, make a roll to see if that's possible. Now, this is something that Megaphone Man has brought up multiple times in his watch-through of Critical Role. He's watching the show for the very first time, and he's essentially arguing that whenever Matt does that, it has a knock-on effect. The more you adjust the rules and make them flexible and malleable, the harder it is for the players to predict how you're going to rule in the future, and that makes it harder for them to interface with the game. And I think that is a valid issue, but for the purposes of today's topic, there's another side effect that we should talk about. Namely, Matt set a precedent early on that spells and some other rules were malleable. If a player had a cool idea, he'd be more willing to roll with it. Maybe he'd call for a roll to see if they succeeded, but the option would still be on the table. But then as the show continued and Matt continued to feel the pressure from social media, he started being more strict about running the game rules as written a lot more often. There were probably a lot of factors to why this shift occurred. One was that he was just getting to know the system better, and so he was starting to understand the purpose behind the design of specific rules. For example, when they started the stream, Matt said that the players could cast an action and bonus action spell on the same turn. As the game continued, he realized this was too powerful and walked it back, settling on a compromise for the rest of Campaign 1, where they could still cast 2 leveled spells on the same turn, but one of them couldn't be higher than 2nd level. This compromise seemed to be in place to help smooth over the transition from Pathfinder. character. He also probably started feeling the pressure to represent the game responsibly. Their goal was always to show how easy it was to play the game, but they started to realize that people were also learning how to play from watching them, so Matt probably wanted to make sure he was playing by the rules as often as possible. Third, Matt was, as I said, getting accosted on Twitter for not knowing the rules, and that's not a fun feeling, so he started to work harder to enforce the rules as written. And fourth, Matt was getting accused of fudging the rules to favor his players. So he started getting more strict, probably in order to combat accusations of favoritism, especially towards Marisha, but we'll talk about that another day. That's a whole other topic. However, it might seem like all of that disproves my point. Clearly, playing by the rules matters because Matt was enforcing it. Except as time went on, he started walking back a lot of his harsher tendencies. By the end of Campaign 2, they'd found a much better balance for playing the game the way they wanted to play, where Matt would enforce the rules he cared about, but not be as strict with every rule if it wasn't a big deal to him. The fact that they were pre-recording their games probably helped with this as well. No longer would they spend the time in between each game session watching their DMs fill up with redundant messages about their supposed mistakes. And speaking of the people who would DM Matt and the players about the rules they got wrong, let's revisit the argument that the players should know these spells and the rules just as well as the audience does, because that actually speaks to a pretty important distinction we need to make. The cast members aren't necessarily the same type of nerds as the audience. Now, I hope you understand that I'm not saying that being a nerd is a bad thing, or that being a nerd about Critical Role is a bad thing. You might have noticed, that's kind of my whole deal. Most people who are nerds about Critical Role didn't harass the cast members. I'm also not saying the cast members aren't nerds. They play D&D, they're all big fans of video games, most of them are big anime fans, a bunch of them read lots of cool indie comics during the 2010s, even Sam Riegel used to be a huge comics collector when he was younger. And they do follow some other actual play shows, like Matt and I think Marisha were both big fans of The Adventure Zone during its first campaign. But that doesn't make them the same type of nerd as the folks who would watch 4 hours of Critical Role every week. Now, this is hardly a new phenomenon. Actors often do not have the same level of encyclopedic knowledge about their characters or their past projects as the people who watch their shows do, because being an actor in a show doesn't mean that you're the same type of nerd as the people who remember everything about that show.
Like when you left your quarters for the last time and you opened up your safe, what was the combination?
It's not an actor's job to memorize everything about their show. And while Critical Role isn't a scripted series or just a job, they really are just playing the game every week because they actually enjoy it. That doesn't mean that they're the same type of player as an audience member might be. Someone who watches 4 hours of Critical Role every week, and especially someone who publicly complains about the cast members getting the rules wrong, is more likely to be the type of person who sits down and reviews the rules and spells for D&D in their free time. But the cast of Critical Role doesn't have free time. During the first campaign, they were all working voice actors, and the only reason they could play their game weekly instead of once a month like they used to is because now it's technically a job to show up and play with their friends. In later campaigns, they're also running Critical Role as a company, and every member has other responsibilities. Plus, they have lives and families and other friends and hobbies and stuff. And even if they had free time, there's no guarantee that learning the rules is how they'd spend it, because they might not be the same type of nerds as their fans. Not every D&D player is the same type of person who has the free time to sit down and read through the books. D&D books are pretty dry. They're reference books. They're not really the type of thing most people read for fun. If you want somebody to have a good time reading something, you need to jazz it up a bit. Separate the topic into different articles, break each article up into useful categories, and add some art to make the whole thing flow nicely. All things you can do with today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic resource for presenting your players with material they'll actually want to read. You can create articles for NPCs, locations, magic items, major events, anything you want to share with your players. You can also use the auto-linker feature to form connections between the articles, so your players can follow the hyperlinks and explore your world at their own pace. And you can keep some notes private so your players don't get to see behind the curtain when they read the articles. And right now, World Anvil is hosting Adventure April, where they're inviting you to write a one-shot adventure or a short story with the theme of adventure. It's a great opportunity to get more familiar with how World Anvil can be used to help you prep your game or keep track of the details of your manuscripts. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. That is more than half off. Once again, that is worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Okay, we've talked a lot about some Critical Role specific reasons why the players on that show might not know every spell, but let's zoom out a little bit. Because it turns out there are some other factors besides the fact that they're playing D&D on stream every week, or that they transitioned from Pathfinder halfway through the campaign, or that Matt didn't ask them to read their spells, but still punished them for not doing so only after it was too late. In fact, I might argue that in 5th edition, the rules don't matter as much as they do in other systems. Now, that might seem like a strange statement because the general trend of game design is moving toward simpler, more rules-light systems. That's not universal, but we are seeing a lot of other games that are in development, especially potential dragon killers trying to replicate D&D's core fantasy, and many of them are trying to strip down some of the complexity of 5e. But that was not necessarily the state of the industry when 5e was published. Sure, there were absolutely a ton of rules-like games, like the Powered by the Apocalypse system. All those games were doing extremely well. But if we compare 5e to its most popular predecessors and competition, 2nd edition, 3.5, Pathfinder, even the other games at the time like Call of Cthulhu and Edge of the Empire, 5th edition had a very unique approach to their rule system. The game was deliberately designed to be modular. The creators talked all the time about how dungeon masters should feel empowered to swap rules out, drop the rules they don't like, replace them with other optional rules, or just do their own thing. And because of that design, there's actually a lot more flexibility within the rules of 5e than in a lot of other games. For example, let's look at one of the most common 5e house rules I've seen in the community. Drinking a potion as a bonus action instead of an action. If you want to make a change like that in, Pathfinder, there would be huge ripple effects, because the action economy in Pathfinder is completely different. Swapping out that rule would actually pretty drastically impact the tone of the game you're playing in Pathfinder, and it would have a knock-on effect that would impact the player's expectations for what's reasonable to do on their turn. In 5e, it's kind of not the end of the world to make drinking a potion a bonus action, so a lot of people made that change in their games. Now, that might not be right for your games. Maybe you like the more Dark Souls style feel where drinking a potion takes an action because it's more of a risk. But 5e doesn't have such a specific tone and approach, unlike something like Pathfinder, which is really trying to cultivate a more crunchy experience. And while plenty of people have very reasonably pointed to this as something they do not like about 5e, in this case, its modularity is a feature and not a bug. Because if a GM wants to change the rules a little bit, or even just hand wave away the ones they don't care about, they can do that, and it won't break the game. Even the designers of 5th edition don't play the rules precisely as written when they run streamed games. Because when they're in the middle of the game and something seems cool or interesting, even though it's not according to the rules, they can just do it, and it doesn't break the game. This is the level of nuance that some terminally online D&D fans seem to struggle with. They treat it as common wisdom that playing strictly according to the rules is a good thing, is the best thing you can do, and that anyone who deviates from the rules is therefore bad. A DM who doesn't know the rules for improvised damage, so they just come up with their own on the fly? That's a bad DM. A player who gets a couple of traits mixed up? That's a bad player. And if that's you, then I think you're missing the point. Even if 5e was as strict a game as the crunchier systems like Pathfinder, I think that's a very unhealthy attitude for what is essentially make-believe with math. But especially because of how 5e is designed, I think it's a really bad fit for the culture this game is trying to promote. I'm not trying to argue that GMs should always ignore the rules, because it is important to be as consistent in your rulings as you can, so you can build a shared language with your players and they can make better choices in the moment. But it's also not the end of the world if you change things to better match the game you're trying to run and the story your players are excited to tell. Now, as I discussed in my most recent Critical Role Demystified episode, there was a scene in the Vox Machina campaign where Vax and Scanlan used Dimension Door to teleport inside of a dragon, which is against the rules of how Dimension Door works. And I praised Matt for ignoring the restrictions on Dimension Door that would keep his players from executing this ridiculous plan. Sure, mechanically, you can't use Dimension Door to go somewhere where another living creature already is, but this plan is amazing. It's high risk, high reward. It's a plan where the players are willingly throwing themselves into a dangerous situation, and it has internal logic to it, especially given how most of these players might think about teleportation thanks to other fantasy and sci-fi stories they're more familiar with. I basically said, yeah, who gives a shit if it's not how the rule works? It's extremely cool and extremely dramatic. But I got a comment that didn't agree with me, and I'm going to read that comment now and then respond to it. You use the rules to derive drama from them, not fuck the rules so that you can have drama. If the rules don't matter, then they might as well just be doing improv. Hey buddy, I've got bad news for you about how similar our hobby is to doing improv. Well, okay, so that was my initial reaction. But thinking about this a bit more, I wanted to understand where this commenter was coming from. And I actually think this is probably a reasonable piece of advice for some D&D games, but it's a very poor critique of Critical Role. Let me explain. From my perspective, the rules aren't there to provide drama. They're there to provide consistency. You can absolutely throw out the rules to get more drama. You should be very careful when doing so. After all, if you do that every time, you erode the ability for your players to rely on the rules and predict your rulings. We talked about that before. But I personally have no trouble saying, look, that's not at all how the rules work, but you know what? It's awesome, so I'll say it is possible. You'll have to roll. Let's see how it goes. But I want to put myself into the mindset of this commenter. To them, from what I understand, the rules exist to create drama. So if Liam and Sam are at the table and they propose the plan, we want to teleport into the dragon, it sounds like the commenter's argument is that you should reply, well, that's not how the spell works, so you'll need to find some other way to accomplish what you're trying to do. And then the goal would be for the players to use their creativity and find an option that is still compatible within the rules of the game. That's what he means, I'm assuming, by the rules providing drama. For example, maybe the players have to jump onto the dragon's back and click the rod there to try to hold him down. Or if they're dead set on getting the rod into the dragon, they could find some other way of getting it into the dragon's belly.
Where are they going?
Now, I don't know this commenter from Adam. I don't know what kind of games they like to play, but this does seem to me like the mindset of the folks who engage with this hobby more like a war game. To those folks, I can see the argument that the challenge is far more about how the players can overcome tasks within the boundaries of the established rules. And if that's your mentality, then yeah, I guess the way Matt handles some of the rules and rulings on Critical Role might not make a lot of sense to you. But that's also why I feel like this is an especially poor critique of Critical Role. Let me elaborate. There's a tweet I saw at some point that I've tried so hard to track down. If I'm able to, I'll put it up here. I haven't been able to find it by the time I'm recording. If you know the tweet by my description of it, then please leave it in the comments below. But basically, the tweet argues that while it's perfectly reasonable for us as audience members to talk about what we'd like to see from a piece of media, there is a line where our recommendations and ideas are just never going to be what those creators are going to do. And it's on us to realize when we've hit that point where we're basically trying to order a hot dog from a hardware store. And even though Critical Role was live streamed and the audience could theoretically interact with the players during and in between games, I think that sentiment still applies here. For example, I talk a lot about the things that I think Matt and the players could do differently. But I also run games that have a lot in common with Matt's style. I'm also approaching these episodes with the benefit of hindsight, so I know where the tone of this show is ultimately going, and how the cast will eventually learn some of these lessons, or how not having learned these lessons have had actual consequences in future episodes. So I feel like I'm connecting with this show on its own terms. However, I don't usually make complaints about the types of characters these players rolled up, because that's not a reasonable thing to complain about, because they're going to play the characters they want to play, and they should be able to do so. If your argument is that Matt should never fudge the rules to allow badass things to happen in his games, then I'm sorry, this hardware store does not sell hot dogs. That's part of Matt's style, and if that's not your thing, that's totally fine. But asking Matt to run his games the way you'd run yours is a level of fan entitlement that is just really unproductive for everyone involved. Now, I don't mean to put that on this commenter. I have no way of knowing if they've got any sort of fan entitlement. That's weird. The first part of their comment isn't showing up. Let's see how they opened up their remarks. RIP this channel. Every time a YouTuber has a baby, the channel dies. Wow, okay, never mind. What an asshole. What a bizarre way to respond when somebody announces that they had a baby. Setting aside the fact that this is my job and I need to keep doing it to pay the bills, and setting aside the fact that that comment was left on one of the longest videos I've ever made on this channel, imagine the level of entitlement needed to respond to the miracle of childbirth by complaining that you might get slightly less free content. I'm not trying to strawman the people who make these arguments, they just keep being assholes, I don't know what to tell you. Now, the argument from these sorts of pedants that always circle the idea that the right way to play the game is to play using all the rules precisely as written. But here's something that they don't seem to be able to acknowledge. Nobody actually plays their games according to every rule. Even if you're playing completely rules as written, people still make mistakes. In my first session as the elf cleric Kamaria Jericho, who you can actually see me recreating in my Baldur's Gate playthrough, but in our home game, the first time I was in combat, I cast Sacred Flame on an enemy. So I rolled to attack, and I missed. And then when my turn next came around, I realized, oh wait, this spell requires a saving throw, not an attack roll. Once I got Spiritual Weapon at higher levels, it took me months before I realized that the spell does not require concentration. Hell, I played an Illusion Wizard for 3 years. I got all the way up to level 20 and beyond. I thought I knew the spell seeming really well, but there are a bunch of times in my Critical Role Demystified series where I pointed out how Matt was basically house ruling something about the spell, and it was only really recently that I realized, oh wait, no, they're playing it rules as written, or at least that's a perfectly reasonable way of reading the rules, based on a sentence I had just forgotten about. Now, when we're audience members for an online game, we have the benefit of not having to make these choices in the moment. We have the advantage of just sitting back and only having to think about the math and the rules. The players, on the other hand, actually have to make decisions. They have to be in the moment, but they also have to think about what they're going to do next. And that changes your relationship with everything that's happening at the table. They might not hear everything perfectly because they're also thinking about what they want to do. But we have a much better chance of not mishearing or misunderstanding things because we're not in the same situation as them. It's like the difference between being in a conversation and realizing you haven't heard what someone has been saying over the past 15 seconds or so because you've been thinking about how you're going to respond, and watching a movie where you don't have to interact with them. You don't have any obligation to reply, so you can just passively sit back and judge the characters for not responding how you think you would if you were there in the moment. Now, everything I've said so far, I feel like is pretty uncontroversial. These are all ideas that I find to be pretty reasonable counterpoints to the argument that it's bad for the cast to get some things wrong now and then. But now I'm going to make an argument that I don't know if anybody else is going to agree with, but I actually feel very strongly about it. Because if your argument is that the players should know how to play D&D because they're playing it on an actual play show and presenting the game for an audience, I actually think you're completely misunderstanding the value of an actual play show. The point of playing these games online, aside from telling a compelling story, is to help demonstrate just how easy it is to actually get into these games. Actual play shows do an amazing job of reducing the barrier to entry for new players, and there is definitely a conversation to be had about whether or not new players should learn the rules from actual play shows, especially if they're getting the rules wrong, and that is a legitimate point. But if we can normalize the conversations I proposed earlier, where Matt could just ask the players to read the spell out loud and talk it through with the player, then we could actually normalize the idea that players and GMs don't have to memorize the rules. Because I honestly believe that it's a good thing to have actual play shows where the players aren't experts in the game they're playing. It helps to reduce the stigma that you have to memorize this game, and it normalizes making mistakes. That's another one of the many reasons I disliked Matt's habit of punishing players for misreading spells or misunderstanding their abilities. Because it sends the message to new players watching Critical Role that they can't make mistakes, because the consequences could be disastrous. And I think that is the absolute wrong lesson to send to an audience. We shouldn't expect every actual play player to always get the rules right, not just because it's probably not why they sat down to play the game, but I actually don't think that's as useful to the hobby as allowing the players to sometimes get things wrong and demonstrate that, yeah, it's actually okay to not have these 400-page rule books memorized. Now, don't get me wrong. If you happen to have an encyclopedic memory of these books, I'm happy for you. And if you and your fellow players never get a rule wrong during your home games, that's also awesome. But here's the thing, and it is kind of important. If Matt's players get the rules wrong, who cares? It's only Matt's business whether his players get the rules wrong or not. Now, I want to be clear. It's okay if it bothers you. That's fine. We can't always control what gets under our skin or what rubs us the wrong way. And I don't personally think it's the end of the world to leave a comment with the correct rule just to make sure the information is out there for people who are learning the game and just to get it out of your system. But like, don't harass people. Maybe even don't trash talk people. There's a difference between critiquing and complaining, and you got the rules wrong isn't really a critique, it's just a complaint. Not knowing the rules to a game doesn't actually make them worse people. Knowing all the rules to that same game doesn't make you a better person. Knowing the rules also doesn't make you a better player. Sure, it might make you a better player at your table, depending on what your table values. And I can see the argument that not knowing the rules slows down the game, and that can be irritating. But like, Will Wheaton and Will Friedle and Mary Elizabeth McGlynn didn't know 5th edition at all when they first guest starred on Critical Role. Felicia Day seemed to have a better grasp of the system from my estimation, but it was still brand new to the rest of those players. They got things wrong or misunderstood stuff. They asked lots of clarifying questions, and that did slow down play. They were also amazing players. They had well-developed characters, they did their best to serve the story and not just themselves, they had an amazing time, and they added to the fun of the game. Not knowing the rules did not make them bad players or reduce the experience for the other players. But of course, you might be saying, but Mike, it's one thing if they're new players, but the cast that's been playing the same game for years should know all the rules. I just disagree. Characters change over time. They get new spells. Every time that happens, they basically are new players again. And it's okay if they take a bit of time to figure out the new rules for their character. Now, you could still say, well, I wouldn't want to play with players who seemed to make no effort to learn the rules. That's fine. There are plenty of things the players on Critical Role do that I would definitely crack down on if they played at my table. But Matt doesn't. So we can assume and conclude that some of this behavior must not bother him as much as it bothers you or me. I think some folks also see the players making apparently no effort to learn the rules as a sign that the players don't care about the game, that they don't respect the campaign. but they clearly do. They are constantly emotionally affected by the events of the game. They think about the game almost all the time in between sessions. They are still thinking about their characters years after their campaigns are over. They made a TV show based off of their game. They are clearly invested, but they're putting their energy towards the parts that excite them the most, which is obviously the role-playing and the larger story. Also, just because someone can't remember something doesn't mean they're not making an effort to learn it. It just means that they can't remember it, and that's not the same thing. Especially if you don't learn things by reading them, which is true for a lot of people. So, like, if you're planning to argue that if somebody gets something wrong, that means that they're not trying, then that's really reductive in a way that I think is harmful, if not actively ableist, so I strongly suggest you reconsider that argument. Again, if you're someone who knows the rules really well, I get it if it bothers you. I definitely notice when people get rules wrong, and I used to be the type of person who made it other people's problems. I didn't bother celebrities online about it, but I did make it an issue at my own D&D games, and arguably that's worse. I wasn't hiding behind anonymity, I was just being disruptive. But I'm not at that point anymore, at least I try not to be. Nowadays, when I see something like the druid in the D&D movie shifting directly from one form into another, or shifting into the owlbear, which is a monstrosity and not a beast, I just think to myself, oh, that's not how it works. And then I move on with my day. In the Critical Role Demystified video for episode 50, I did discuss how Travis had misremembered his exhaustion and was rolling with disadvantage for no reason. But that's not the end of the world. And in fact, in hindsight, considering that I didn't have a lesson there, I think I lingered on it too much, because I only try to talk about the things that I think move the story forward, or that we can learn from. When a player just gets a rule wrong, that doesn't fall under either category, unless we can learn something from how the cast handles it at their table. So, look, it's fine to not love it when the cast gets a rule wrong, but if your reaction involves leaving a nasty comment to trash talk them, even on someone else's channel like mine, then I just don't think that's a good use of your time or your energy. It also sends a signal to other players in this space that they would not be allowed to make mistakes or get things wrong, and I think that's a really harmful attitude to put out there. So, in other words,
Get a life, will you, people?
thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. It's definitely going to be something I'm going to be linking back to a couple of times throughout my Critical Role Demystified series, especially when people get spicy in the comments. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you can stay notified whenever I drop a new video. I put out 2 videos a week most of the time, so I do have lots of non-Critical Role videos that I am really proud of, so if you're only here for the Critical Role content, I really hope you subscribe so you can check out some of my other videos. If you want to support the channel financially, please consider joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. You could see every video early and ad-free. You could commission future videos. There's a ton of great perks available for you. You can also join my Discord server to hang out with some other awesome people, and you can sign up for my newsletter to stay up to date with my latest updates when I happen to send them out. I need to do that soon. Click here to check out my latest video. It's about whether or not players can break your games. I'm on a roll. I'm tackling all the ways people blame players for things that I think are not actually real problems. Until next time, play fair and have fun.
Just so we're clear, everybody, I'm going to switch back to Liam. This is a game. This is a game. Which camera's on me? This is a game.